All right, good morning, team. This is 4.3 sales forecasting. What we are going to do today is we are going to look at a couple of slides for sales forecasting. So one of them is going to be more of a theory-based slide. The other one is going to actually go through with the calculations. I'll try and move as quick as possible. So sales forecasting, it's a quantitative management technique that lets you predict the sales that you're getting over a given period of time. So what it can do is help you figure out problems in advance, if you're going to have any cash flow issues, because obviously sales are heavily related to cash flow, as well as things like staffing. Do you need more people certain times a year when sales spike up? Do you need less people, more resources, less raw materials? All of those decisions can come. So there are three kind of techniques for sales forecasting: extrapolation, market research, and time series analysis. Extrapolation is when you use a trend line, so you get a whole bunch of data points and you make a line, and then you're able to extend that line just to predict that, okay, it'll continue at this rate. So the method is only useful for predictions in the near future, because obviously when you extrapolate too far ahead of time, they become not very relevant. Stuff happens, Corona comes and the whole world shuts down, you know what I mean? So the technique works really well if there's a really strong relationship between two sets of numbers. So if you have a lot of history and there's a strong correlation, so for example, the correlation between marketing spending and sales growth. So obviously those might be related. The more sales go up, that could impact the amount that you spend on marketing, right? So when you look at it here, this is a diagram from the book. You've got, these are the actual sales, so you can see they're going up and down and up and down. And then this is the trend, this line. So they're generally, although they're going up and down, you're seeing over time an increase. Look, when you started, you had less and then more sales over time. So it's an upward facing path or trend. Extrapolation is when you then look at the remaining amount of the trend right here. So you can see that clearly you could expect sales to continue to go up over time according to this graph. Market research is another way of forecasting. So that's when you identify buying habits of consumers by going around and actually researching them. So when a business becomes lazy or complacent, they fail to recognize any change in demands. So the market research helps them get ahead of the curve and know exactly what's going on. If there's falling demand in some areas, they can either try and advertise and increase it, or look to new products and then improve their sales overall. So there are a few examples here of GM, for example. Even though they were the top global producer for 76 years, they became lazy, complacent, and they started producing too many cars. They assumed people would continue buying at the same rate. And they did not recognize any change in demand. So even big companies, if they don't do market research, can end up failing. There's a whole chapter on market research next. The third way of forecasting, so the first one is looking at trend lines. The second one is doing actual market research and getting real data. The third aspect of sales forecasting is a time series analysis. So this is where quantitative sales forecasting method, it predicts future sales levels from past sales data. So you look at the past and then you predict the future. So it relies on time series data, and this is sales information the businesses have kept over a period of time. They really rely on this past data to try and predict the future. So the different elements of time series are seasonal variations, cyclical variations, and random variations. So seasonal variation is where there's different demands over the course of the year because of the seasons changing. So when a business gets a huge increase in sales in clothing at the beginning of a new year, it might experience a decline in sales towards the middle of the year. So sometimes, for example, like back to school sales, a lot of people might start buying a lot of backpacks and stationery and things like that, and then it'll kind of peter off towards the end. So you can see that there are definitely instances where seasonal variations occur, and a lot of times they're repeated and occur within 1 year or less. So it's a whole cycle within a year. Cyclical variations are tied into the business cycle in an economy. So sales could be on the rise during a growth phase, on the low end with the recession phase. So unlike seasonal, where it's the time of year, cyclical depends on the type of economy. So sales are up in a strong economy, sales are bad in a weak economy. So cyclical variations can actually extend to more than a year if you have serious issues with an economy. So that's the main difference there. Random variations, so this is where there's fluctuations that stand out. There's really no trend, no reason. For example, there could be a sudden increase in demand for ice cream during a really rare warm day in the winter. So that one day, we would have, like, imagine here in Dubai, if it just like randomly rains one day, you might all of a sudden get a whole bunch of umbrellas sold. While normally we wouldn't have that level of sales in umbrellas during this time of year. So those are examples of random variations. They're unpredictable and can occur pretty much at any time. So what do you consider when choosing the right technique? First, you need to look at how accurate your forecasts need to be. If you have more certainty and you're more comfortable in your numbers, then obviously less thorough methods of sales forecasting are needed. You also need to look at how far ahead the forecast needs to be. Is it just for a few months, or is it a few years? Is it the next day? It's more difficult to predict sales and levels over several years. So just remember that. So depending on how far ahead your forecast is, that could help you pick the right method. How much availability do you have of cost data and information collection? Is there a lot of access to the wealth of information, or and is it cheap enough too, or is it expensive and or not available? Another thing you want to consider is the stage of your product's life cycle. Market research, rather than time series, will be used a lot of times in the R&D or the launch stage of the product life cycle. So if you're at the very beginning where you haven't even kind of set your product out to the market, then you're going to be using market research instead of a time series analysis because you have no history, right? So there's a lot of techniques used, and you're going to have to go back and remember these. Hopefully you've studied them in maths and in other courses, but you need to know what a mean is. So a mean is when you add everything up and divide it by the number in the data set to come up with an average, right? So if you have 10 numbers, you add those 10 numbers together and divide all of that by 10, and that tells you the average. The median is literally where you rank them all in order. So those same 10 numbers, put the smallest number at the front, then the next largest, all the way till the end, and you pick the number in the very middle. So you're not dividing or doing anything like that. You're literally just selecting the middle set of data from those 10. Mode is a number that has the most frequency. So let's say out of those 10 numbers, 3 of them were the same exact number, 888, right? So the one with the highest frequency in the set is the mode. Range is the numerical difference between the highest and lowest. So if your highest number was 100 and your lowest was 40 out of those 10 numbers, your range would actually be 60, 100 minus 40. Very easy, right? Standard deviation, a little more technical. So this measures the difference of a variable from the mean, the average value in a data set. So it's just looking at pretty much how big is the spread of data that you're looking through. So that moves us into moving averages, which is the main section of forecasting. You need to be able to calculate moving averages as 3-part and 4-part moving averages, and it helps you set these trend lines and predict your sales so that you can make decisions as a business. Moving averages are a more accurate method of identifying trends, and they're really useful for sales forecasting. Moving average, they try and establish underlying trends. What they do is they try and get rid of these random variations and the cyclical and seasonal data. They try and smooth it out so that you have a more accurate line, and it helps you make better decisions. So there are 2 types. There's the 3 and the 4. I'm going to move out of this one and move into another one because this one actually has better data. So we've been through all that. Ready? Okay, so the first thing you need to do is just some quick practice. Are you able to calculate a mean of sales? So remember, a mean is where you add everything up, divide it by however many numbers, and then you get an average. So in this case, you'd add 100 plus 110 plus 120 plus 95 plus $130,000, divide it by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 months, all right? That would give you 111,000. Hopefully you got that right. So there's something called a moving average. So how to calculate a 3-part or 3-month moving average is the first thing you do is you add the first 3 months and then get the average. So in this case, you can see that's 100 plus 110 plus 120. Divide that by 3. That gives us $110,000. Next step is you repeat it, but for the next 3. So there's going to be a little bit of overlap. So now you're going to look at month 2, 3, and 4. So you started with month 1, 2, 3. Then you've got 2, 3, 4. And then guess what? You're going to do 3, 4, 5. That's going to give you 3 answers in the end. And then you plot those on a graph, and then that gives you sort of a moving average curve. So you took 100, 110, 120, these 3, divided by 3, got you $110,000. Then you take 110, 120, 95, divided by 3, gives you 108, 333. Finally, 120, 95, 130,000, divided by 3, because it's 3 months we're looking at, gives you $115,000. Very easy to calculate, right? So in a 3-part moving average, you should have 3 different points at the end where you've added. So remember, you start at month 1, 2, 3, then 2, 3, 4, then 3, 4, 5. I think that's simple. I hope you agree with me. So what you do is you calculate. So you can see here that we're putting in our 3-month moving part averages. Those are the numbers we just calculated, right? So from here, 110, this is representing the average of these 3 numbers. 108 is the average of these 3 numbers. And 115 is the average of these 3 numbers. So that's the 3-point moving average. All right. So now there's 3 things that you capture in a 3-point moving average. Yes, the method is pretty time consuming, but managers really get to understand what's going on. And it smooths out those irregular fluctuations so you can get a really much more accurate picture of what's happening. So the third part of a 3-point moving curve graph or chart is going to be the variation of the actual trend. All right. So you can see here that so when you have the moving part averages, see how you're going to put it in the middle of the 3. It lets you compare against what's going on in that month itself. So if our 3-part moving trend is 110,000 in month 2, well, look, the actual sales was 110,000, so it was actually really accurate by month 2. Like, you were spot on. If you use that 3-part moving average, you would get a really accurate result of your sales. In month 3, we had $120,000. You can see here that we were a bit under in our prediction. So the 3-part moving average, the curve is slightly under what's actually happening. So the variation is we're $111,666 actual over our average, right? But then look, we swung to under. So 95,000 was the actual sales in month 4. So it might have been a seasonal dip, something like that. There could be many reasons why it dropped. Our moving average at that point was $115,000. So we were 20 under. So you can see how it could be bang on, it could be a little above, a little below, but in general, it gives you a pretty accurate timeline. So that's how you calculate. So once again, you start at the beginning, you add up the first 3, get the first data point, you're going to put it under the middle of that. You add up the next 3, you're going to put it under the middle of month 3, you add up the next 3, put it under the middle of month 4, put it in the chart, then you can see the variations. Because when you have that and that, that's 0. That minus that is a positive 11,000. That minus that is a negative 20,000. It just gives you a good picture of what's going on. Got it? All right. So this is just an example. If you guys want to pause here and do a practice, okay? And here's the answer. So the different 3 or 4-part moving trends. So for Wednesday, Tuesday to Thursday, Wednesday to Friday, Thursday to Saturday, yada, yada, yada. So there you go. Those are the answers, okay? Got it. Great. All right, let's look at 4-part moving averages. So this one is a little more complicated in that we use something called centering. So there's a whole nother, so you still have the variation column, you have the moving average column, and you have the actual sales column with the months. The centered trend is what's new. So literally what you're doing in the centered trend is, so now you're adding 4 of these together. Instead of 3, you're going to do 1, 2, 3, 4. All right? So you're going to add up 100,000 plus 110 plus 120 plus 95 divided by 4, and that gets you your 106,250. Then you do the same again, 110, 120, 95, 130 gets you this, and then continue to 120, 95, 130, 125, it gets you that. Finally, 95, 130, 125, 128 gets you that. The center trend is where you then take the two 4-point moving averages and you average those out. You find a center line for those. And then you do the same here between these two, and then the same here between these two. The variation is calculated from the center trend. So it's even more, you can tell, it's even more accurate. It's going to be even closer, probably to the sales than on only a 3-point moving average. So the more data you have, the easier it is. So you can see that you have 7 months of sales here. So you can come up with a better trend line than in the previous example where we only had 5 months of sales. So if you have minimum 5 months, you need to do a 3-point moving average. You need at least 7 months of sales to do a 4-point moving average. But it's the same exact concept, right? To get this 4-point moving average, you add the first 4 months together, divide it by 4. Then to get the second one here, you add the next 4 months divided by 4. Next 4 months and the next 4 months, it gets you all these. To get the centered trend, you just add the two, all of the 4-point, you take averages of all the 4-point moving averages. So the average of these two, the average of these two, the average of those two, and then from there you can calculate your variation. So the actual sales was 120, your centered point is 110, 10,000 is your variation. You were 10 over. You were negative 20,000 under, 11,000 over. Overall, you'll probably hit the average pretty close to the actual sales. Good? All right? Not that hard, not that hard. So there are benefits and weaknesses, obviously, like everything else here. So let me go back to the other slide because those were really good. Sorry, I'm jumping around with you guys. So by the way, when you can even create a trend line out of this, right? By plotting all the moving averages and things like that. So it's all just about forecasting and getting an idea of where you're going, so you can do things like staffing correctly and ordering the right amount of supplies and all that fun stuff. Are we good? Okay. What we need to do is look at the 4-point moving average advantages and disadvantages. So these are both moving averages. They're both useful for identifying and applying seasonal variation. So you can see when there are variations and then react. Reasonably accurate short-term forecasts. So when the economy is stable. If it's not stable, not so much. It can identify seasonal variations for each time period, and then it helps you plan for the future. It is complex though. These are the disadvantages. Forecasts further in the future are less accurate. And then forecasting for longer term may require more qualitative methods. And therefore, you're not as dependent on your history data, right? It's more about what's going on in the outside. There are lots of benefits. If marketing managers are able to predict the future accurately, the risk to the business is really reduced. And remember, everything you're doing as a manager is trying to avoid risk, increase profits, create more efficiency. A precise forecast of monthly sales over the next 2 years could be made. The benefits are really, really immense. So if you're able to do that, you're going to be sitting pretty. The production department are going to know exactly how much to produce, how many materials to order. The marketing department are going to know how many products are going to be distributed, whether changes to the marketing mix are needed, changing prices, place, the promotion strategies, all that stuff. For the HR, you can get the right workforce in place, make sure you don't have too many or too few staff. For finance, cash flow, you know when you need a lot of cash. Oh, we're going to be ordering a lot of supplies, make sure cash flow is good there. Limited information though is the biggest issue. When you don't have access to data, like the past trends, if it doesn't show you the whole picture, or if it's just not accurate data, the whole thing becomes a useless exercise, right? So there could be a lot of inaccuracies of prediction. We talk about GIGO, there's a garbage in, garbage out. So if there's rubbish data, then the forecasts and all the planning and stuff is going to end up being garbage. Sorry about that. So I hope that was helpful to you. I kind of went through it fairly quickly, but sales forecasting isn't that complicated. I'm going to attach the slides to it. There's a lot of the revision slides and stuff on there too. So extra information for you to read through. This is HL only, and like on the surface, it does seem a bit complicated, but it's really not that bad. All right, good luck, guys. Peace out.